Hello, this is Tom, this is Quick Watercolour Birds. In this one we're going to tackle a very small bird with a lot of colour. Let's have a look. Okay, so a fantastic little garden bird here in the UK, and this is the Blue Tit. We see them all the time. We grew up with a lot of people having these as their favourite birds because they're fairly common, they're fairly easy to recognise, but they're so much fun to paint. They're beautiful little things. They're full of character, they've got some amazing shapes in there, and they've got some great opportunity for lots of wet into wet work, loads of interesting colours, as well as a few challenges. Just like the Kingfisher, we've got all of these different areas of colour. On the whole, there's a bias towards kind of green and blues, so it's not so imperative that these colours don't run together. We have an opportunity, like I said, for a bit more wet into wet work, but at the same time we still need some areas of kind of crispness. There's areas where we can explore the markings a little bit more, and also probably one of the hardest things is getting yellow in shadow, and this is something I'm going to talk about more in the video. As always, I will talk you through the drawing and then every aspect of the painting, and remember, this is quick, fun watercolour birds, loads of paint, loads of water, having a bit of a splash. Just before we get into drawing, let's have a look at the colours. In this case, although I've got a real bias towards using warm yellows, as you may have noticed, in this case we've got an opportunity to use a slightly cooler Imidazilone Yellow, but you could replace this with lemon yellow as well, and there's a few other cooler yellows like Pyrole Yellow. Secondly, I use actually two blues, and I'll explain why. One is a Maganese Blue, quite similar to cerulean. It's kind of greeny, kind of bias, a little bit cooler, but it's not quite as full on as Pthalo. If you don't have manganese, maybe a lot of you don't, you could use Pthalo Blue, or you could even use Prussian Blue, which is the second blue that I have out. So Prussian Blue again is quite a greeny blue. It's got a bias towards kind of yellowy greeniness. But at the same time it's a little bit duller and a little bit grayer, so I use it in this case to actually subdue the manganese and give me the beautiful colours on the back of the Blue Tit, but also in the background as well, which you will see. And then although there's actually no red in the Blue Tit, as always we're always looking to have at least one of each primary so that we can balance them all the time. We've got a lot of green and yellow here, and what we need the red for is to help subdue these colours, because in watercolour we don't have the white to help pastelise colours, so we have to get a little bit better at just balancing all the primaries in order to dull colours down. So that's it, guys. Don't forget, you can find the line drawing over on my Patreon page. You can get it there publicly, completely for free. You can check out everything else that I've got over there. There's different tiers where we look at different levels of kind of tutoring and even mentorship at some of the higher levels, and you can also support this video and the podcast over there. So let's look at the drawing. Okay, so here we go. I've got my drawing in place. As usual, I'm going a little bit heavier just so that you guys can see the drawing at this stage. And again, what we're looking for here is simple shapes to start, and you'll see it over and over again in these videos. I'm looking for the big body shape to start with, quite often an egg or a circle, and then that angle through the circle. In this case the head is very broad, the way it sits on top of the body. There's a few little alterations I can see I need to make as I'm looking at this. That white bit needs to come up there and then come down there a little bit, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then once we've got the big shapes in place, then we stick on the smaller shapes like the beak. Then we start to think about the wing as almost like a triangle stuck on the side. What angle is that triangle? Little things to watch out for. If I draw a line from the front of the head, it comes just in front of the chest. Now you could change that, but make it a conscious decision and not kind of an accident. It's so easy to accidentally move things into the wrong place, and it will completely alter the feeling of the bird. And there's a place to do that, and I do it very often, but like I keep saying, make it a conscious decision. Look for the angle of the tail as well. In relation to that, look for the angle through the eye and through the beak. Don't overstate the beak, don't overstate the eye. A little bit smaller on mine. And then we can, again, appearing to be quite a complex bird, but actually if we start with the big shapes, then just simply break up the smaller shapes. How high is the eye in the head? Let's draw a little line around the white, where the white is going to be, and then we can start to break up the big shapes into smaller shapes. Where, as we draw, can we think about letting the paint flow together versus where we might need to leave some little bits of the white of the page to denote markings and stuff like that. Again, we can always pop them in with an opaque colour, but there's something lovely about trying to capture the nature of the white and the markings without having to kind of go to an opaque colour unless we really have to. And that's really it with this one, guys. Keep it really simple. They've got this funny kind of chunky roundness to them. They're funny little birds, but they're really beautiful to paint. And that's it. I'm going to give it a quick rubber to make it a bit lighter, and then we're just going to dive in with the paint. Okay guys, so we get to this stage. We're happy with the drawing, and then we think, well, where on earth do I start? And so what I don't want to teach you necessarily in these videos is a formula for painting specific things or painting in a certain way. I have a certain way of painting. What I hope is this informs you to find your own way with the medium using these kind of quicker results. But my point is that when it comes to where to start, quite often I think, well, what's the easiest bit to understand? And it's going to be different for everyone, but quite often the biggest shapes are easiest to understand. Here there's a very big shape here, but it's quite complex, so I'm kind of erring away from that. This is fairly simple, but the details are with the dark, so it's maybe a bit too early to go to that. So what this leaves for me is kind of this area down here, and this is where I'm going to dive in. I want to trap a little bit of light on the edge of the tail there, and then I'm going to kind of work here. We've got a lovely little light just there, so I'm going to leave that as the white of the page, and then that colour is going to get lighter as it comes up here, and it's going to become more of a faded colour. And then we can use the brush to pull out some of the heavier pigment so that we can a bit of a lighter colour. And then it's weird, the colour as it goes into shadow almost becomes a bit greeny, but it's a very neutral kind of greeny shadow colour. It's quite hard to mix. I really struggle with it. But basically if you take your yellow and your red, you get orange. If you mix in a tiny bit of blue and keep adding little bits of blue, you'll get quite a lovely, like a lovely muted, see that colour? It's kind of yellow in shadow. The colour that I find probably one of the hardest ones to mix, because if we add red only, we obviously get orange. If we add blue only to darken it, we obviously get green, which we don't necessarily want in this case. And so what we're effectively doing is using purple to darken it. And I know that sounds odd, but it's because it's the complementary, so it darkens it in a more neutral way. And what's the equivalent of adding purple? Well, the equivalent of adding purple is basically the same as adding a little bit of red and a little bit of blue, which when mixed by themselves with no yellow around would make purple. So that's kind of why that works. And then what we can do is just drop some slightly stronger colour back into it. Just having a little bit of a play around with the colour. Where do I want it to be a rich yellow? There we go. I'm going to blob that yellow in there. That's where we're going to get our richness of colour, and maybe a little blob of it there. Too much. There we go. And then I might actually, I'm thinking about it, I'm making this up as I'm going along obviously, is getting a little bit of greenery in the background, but I'm going to start by putting in some, actually putting in some yellow that's later going to become green. And we might even get a bit of green in it now, but that's going to use that as like a sweep of colour behind the bird. I'm just going to start with the yellow. And what that's going to allow me to do is also trap a bit of light on the front of the bird. We could even introduce a little bit of kind of a coolish green colour now, as long as it doesn't go into the yellow of the bird itself. So it's quite safe to do it up there. A little bit more risky to do it here. And what I might do is just pull out a bit of pigment there. We get a nice little light on the chest, and then we're going to just feed some green into it now and let it kind of blend in a little bit. Yeah, so there's room for kind of playing around as we go, and we can always go darker later and kind of make that work. So I don't want that green to spread into the chest of the Blue Tit there, so we're just going to bring it up close there, and that should just about do it. So a little bit of a sensitive touch, which may be a little bit more kind of fussy than I would want at this stage, but it's felt like suddenly the right thing to do, so we're just going to go for it. And I probably will come back over that kind of later on. But that for me is a nice, fairly simple start. So now that that's dried off plenty, we can start going to some of the more interesting colours. And what we're going to do is start placing these in here, and just with nice simple brush strokes, kind of little flicks of the brush, not being afraid to get some of the white of the page still showing through. I think that's really nice. It gives texture and a bit more form to things, or a bit more interest, I should say, not so much form but interest. And then while that is wet, we can go in with some of darker colours, less paint, more pigment. So taking a lot of the pigment out of the brush and having a more like a damper mix. And we can start to work kind of wet into wet with a more damp mix. Kind of in there. A bit more shadow coming in under there. And some nice shapes in the tail. And then we just let that dry. And we can come back on and we can put in some finishing details in that area. Look how the background green is kind of bleeding into the chest. Now, if that was everywhere, I wouldn't be so happy with it. But as it is, I'm quite liking the fact that it's taking a bit of that background colour and bringing it into the bird there. And so far, so good. So now we've got this lovely kind of green on the back. Oh, we've also got a little flick of yellow here, which I want to get now. And again, if the tail kind of bleeds into that yellow, for me, I don't mind too much, as long as it doesn't destroy the yellow, which it won't do. We're all fine. Okay, so just knock that down a little bit so you can see more. So what's the next obvious thing? For me, it's this big shape here. Before we dive into that, I just want to make sure, just bring that up a bit. I just want to make sure that it's not going to kind of disappear into there. Although that's quite a nice colour for the back of the Blue Tit. So let's kind of go for it. Mix that lovely colour. It's a bit more yellowy on the back. It's the Prussian and the yellow. So the Prussian is quite a grubby. It wants to go greeny, but it's also quite a grey blue. So by having a little bit of Prussian in there, it's giving us more the colour of the back of the Blue Tit here, in my opinion anyway. So again, we're just going to place it in there, really simple. It gets more blue as it comes up there. I'm going to leave it as light kind of in there. So that's it, just a nice simple shape. And then we're just going to leave that as it is, but we're going to come into like some stronger blues now. So not going to go too dark too quickly. This is the Maganese Blue. And what we're going to do is look for that kind of wash of Maganese Blue that falls in here. And then just nice and simple. And then here we can just let those colours blend together. I want the blue to go into the green. So I'm kind of coaxing it in there. And then I want that blue to be a bit more, I don't know if steely is the word, but like a more steely blue. So it's got a bit more greyness to it. So that's when our Prussian comes in. And this is the joy of using two blues. We get to vary. We get to vary it a little bit more. We get to vary that colour. Take some of the power out of the manganese. In here we can link some areas together. Go with a dry brush in there. Get that lovely broken brush stroke that I love so much. And that comes into here, and it gets a little bit more kind of purpley grey as it moves towards that area. So it goes from being blue to being purpley grey. And again, I want to be careful not to destroy all of the white of the page here, because I want to leave some of those lovely markings that we get on the wing, just these little white areas, something like that. And then we can take that straight into here. So kind of working out certain aspects of this as I go. So it's not like this was perfectly planned during the drawing stage, but the joy of the drawing stage is it does allow you to kind of at least think about how you might be going to tackle an area. So for me, the drawing stage is not just about the drawing. It obviously is mostly about that, but it's also about discovering the subject as we go. And by that I mean like you're starting to maybe think a little bit about how you're going to paint it as you're drawing it. It's allowing you, yeah, to discover the subject as you go. And what we're getting here is loads of lovely wet into wet, but because I'm using fairly damp paint but not really sopping wet paint, we're starting to get some nice wet into wet stuff, but we're never fully in control with watercolour, but we're as in control as we might ever expect to be, in the sense that we're not letting the paint just disappear into the existing washes. So now I can come in and sharpen up some of these washes. As it's drying, we can go a little bit darker. We can go maybe a little bit more blue up here. So with a damp brush, I'm just going to take some of that blue and the green, and we're going to feed it up into there. And then if some of that bluey green kind of merges together, we're still working wet into wet. So we're still with this principle of kind of lots of wet into wet work. Let's go a little stronger with the green there, and then bring it across the back there. We can go a little bit tighter in the wing, but I don't really want to tighten up too much, but we can go. So I'm just leaving the white of the page to denote the markings on the back of the bird here. Really fun. And then we've got that lovely light marking there, and we can just... Yes, I'm trying to find a balance of detail but not getting too caught up in the detail. And also if I put it in now, it's just going to disappear into the wet. So there's only so much detail I want to get in there. But we're bringing in some darker colours, and just as this tail is drying, I'm just choosing to go a little bit darker in places, and then it can you can kind of leave it to do its thing after that. But just little flicks of the brush here and there. Let's go a little bit softer here. Pull out some of the pigment, go a bit lighter, get a bit more variegation in the wash, so just a variety of colours in the wash. So back here we've got more markings, but I'm just doing them kind of wet into wet, and then we get some really lovely markings there. And that's all going to dry really nicely. There's a few extra shadows to put in the yellow area, but the back of the Blue Tit, I'm actually really happy with that, and I probably will leave it much as it is. It's done everything I would want it to do. That's a phrase I find myself using a lot. Okay, so we can kind of come up into this area just a little bit. I mean, that's an isolated area of blue, so that can wait. This other area, we can start to now explore some of those darker markings. And I'm going to try and stick with a big brush just because it gives me a slightly more lively kind of brush stroke. And I'm going to start coming up to the eye. I might go smaller with the brush as we come up to the eye. But I'm just going to kind of paint around the eye and then use a dry brush, which will give me nice broken brush strokes, just to kind of make it not too even a black line. We get this lovely black line around the eye, but we don't want to make it too even. We want a kind of broken brush stroke, and it breaks into there and it breaks around here. So by broken I mean it's not a really neat edge. It's got a kind of natural feel to it. Kind of does something like that. I'm just going to soften it in a couple of places with a damp brush. I'm just going to hit that edge there, and we get a slightly softer feel to it. And then what I'm going to do is go with my Prussian and my red, and now while it's wet, rather than repaint the whole line, we drop into it while it's still wet. And the paint I'm putting in is not as wet as the paint that's already down, but it's fairly wet, so it will bleed a little bit, or spread, whatever you want to call it. And there we go, we get a much more interesting kind of what appears initially to be a black. Actually, we've made it much more interesting. And now I'm going to go to my smaller brush, and the eye we're going to make very, very simple. You saw the eye being done in the Kingfisher, so here is a very simple version of the eye, similar to the Kingfisher, where we paint the eye and we just paint it all dark, but we just leave a little bit of white showing to give us a little highlight. What we do is then bring the dark very close to it, but leave a little bit of white around the edge. We can even take some of the dark into the eye so we get some markings. It then comes under there and maybe does that sort of a thing. And that's the eye, so simple. It does, especially with these quick watercolour birds, it doesn't need to be kind of overly laboured or anything like that. We keep it really, really simple. And then we're going to take that same approach that we just used for the rest of the black. We're actually going to start with a blue, and we're just going to use the slight dry brush, and we're going to use that dry brush to create that feeling of more kind of natural broken line. And if anything, I've gone a little bit too big with that line. See, the blue's gone a bit too far up there, so I'm going to just hit it, dry it out a little bit, and then put in the black. There we go. There's this feeling of watercolour not being very forgiving, but as long as you go light to start with, you'll never run into too much trouble. I say too much trouble. And then we're kind of coming in down here, and again with just a quick hit of the brush we get a more kind of broken brush stroke, and for me that feels a bit more natural, and that's what we're kind of after. And then while it's wet, we can take our red and our blue, and we just kind of mix it together so we get a nice deep dark. And we're just going to go really dark in there, nice deep dark, and coming under there. And then let's keep this beak really simple. We need to make sure that background is dry before we go in and do that beak. So we're going to come under the beak there and just get that lovely little simple shape for the underside of the beak. And then we can worry about the top of the beak later, just real fine with the brush. And what we might just do is just a little bit of line on the top of the beak there, and then we get into just doing a little wash of grey later on. So actually using a tiny bit of line there. I love line in art. What we don't want is to accidentally end up drawing lines around everything, but that's not to say that there isn't a place for using line, especially in watercolour. It's such a powerful tool, line, when it's used well. It can be very descriptive, it can be very expressive. We just, we don't want to get into the trap of kind of overusing line to sort of delineate things necessarily. That becomes, nothing wrong with it, but it becomes more stylized. So what I'm doing here is putting in some darks, and I'm going to hit the edge of the dark with a soft brush, and we're just beefing up, for want of a better phrase, some of here and just popping in some little bits of detail here and there. And then we just soften that down as well. We don't need to soften it down, it's quite nice as a strong brush stroke, but let's just do that. Okay, so there's some stronger shadow to put in there. The tail on the whole I like. I wonder if we can get some sharper marks. So these are kind of the sharper marks over the top, which tend to sharpen things up and give it a bit more of a finished look. Just little hits here and there. The head obviously needs a little bit more attention to get that lovely blue colour on the top. So nice clean brush. Start with the lighter blue. So a bit of manganese with some water. Not too much water because we want to be able to almost do this in one brush stroke, and I'm going to go that way and then use the dryness of the brush to get that kind of that look in there. And then while it's wet, we're going to drop into the darker side, which is this top bit here. We're going to drop a bit more pigment. Yeah, so just taking a little moment here to have a bit of fun with that kind of wet into wet stuff. And it's possibly a bit too blue, so it's that manganese, which is very strong. So I'm going to take out some of the intensity of the blue, but then remember we're using that Prussian to dull down the blue all the time. So it's not that Prussian is necessarily a really dull blue, but it is a more kind of greyy, steely blue. And getting a bit fussy with the brush strokes there, so I'm going to go back in with the small brush and dampen it down and just hit it like that. Just keep it really simple, and then as just with the wings, we just sharpen up the odd little area. A bit too dark, so go back in and just feed that dark along there and in there. Almost getting a bit too fussy with it, but that's kind of it. And actually I want a damper edge, or a softer edge there. It doesn't work with a hard edge. It's kind of distracting from the rest of the Blue Tit. And then I might leave that to dry and then go back into it one last time to get in. Remember how the darker, more solid lines in here gave it a bit more kind of feeling of finishedness, if that's a word. It's going to be the same thing up here. I wonder if some dark lines towards the end might just help. Again, trying to keep it soft. I think the softness works, or seems to be working, at that top part of the bird up there. Let's just pull that out a little bit. That's better. Bit more variegated. So that term again, variegated, where we get a bit more variety of tone or colour, but in this case tone. And that's worked pretty well. So while that all dries off, I want to glaze over some shadow in this area eventually. But while that all dries off, we're going to finish off this area very quickly. And what we're going to do, we're going to bring in a bit more shadow there. And again, we're trying to get that kind of neutral yellow in shadow colour. Very hard to get. It's bordering on greeny, but I don't want to make it too muddy a colour. So that's just trying to find a balance of what colour to make it. I'm not really sure entirely what colour to make it, so yeah, struggling here to work out what colour, not easy. I wonder if we go a little bit more on the cooler side. We'll give that a go. Let's give it a go under here. So we want a slightly stronger shadow there, and a slightly stronger shadow just coming under the wing and coming down into there and just off there. So it just gives it a bit more structure. And then we also can come down then into the foot, and the foot we can start to give it a bit more strength of tone, which kind of gives it a little something extra. And let's just go under there, kind of being brave and just going for it with the tone, and I think it works. It does, it works. We're okay. We're going to go a little bit of a bolder yellow. Now that this area is all dried off, I just want to bring in a slightly stronger yellow there, just to kind of bring it to life a little bit more. A bit too strong, so just go back in with the damp brush and take some of the power out. Soften that down in places, pull that back out. Yeah, kind of fiddling a little bit, so I'm going to stop. And then there's probably a little something to do in the background, maybe, I don't know. We might do one last bit in the background. What there is to do, I think, is to get some sharper marks in the head. And they don't have to be much, they're just the same sort of sharp marks that I put in. Something like that. And actually I think I like the background. What I might do is just go a little bit darker in places. I might just strengthen that green. I want to make sure that chest is dry first. So I'll very quickly let this dry off and make sure the face is totally dry. We're just going to look at a quick tips section. So in this quick tips section I want to cover something that is like some real kind of mantra for myself that I've used for quite a few years, and I think it's a really important one, and it is simple but accurate shapes. And so what do I mean by this? So quite often we kind of think in order to get a level of kind of realism or a level of finished painting, quite often we think that we need to do a lot of detail, or that detail is the way to do that. But actually for me something that's far more important is, yes, to little bits of detail here and there in your more active areas, but overall it's the simple but accurate shapes that will give a feeling of realism to your bird. So if we take, for example, the beak of a goldfinch, yes, it's quite clearly kind of a triangle, which is a very simple shape, but we do need to make sure it's accurate. So how deep is that triangle relative to how long it is? If we did something like that, it's still a simple shape, but it's not accurate enough for the goldfinch. Equally, if we did it very broad, like that, again, it's the same sort of shape and it's simple, but it's not accurate enough. So we need to really home in. We need to say, well, in this particular bird, what exactly is that angle there? What's the angle through the center there? How deep here is the beak relative to how long it is? And then we can start to do that. So that gives us our kind of accurate shape. And then once we've got that, well, it gives us a simple shape that's relatively accurate. And then what we do is we start to chip away at it. We say, right, it's a little bit more curved under there. Within that simple but accurate shape, there's a little bit stuck on here and in there and like that. So we take it from being a very simple shape to just a little bit more detail, but not loads of detail, and we're really looking for that accuracy. What exactly does that line do? What does that line do? What does it do when it hits there? And then as we break it up, we still want simple but accurate shapes. So this little bit of dark here is a simple shape. It's just a dark, but it is an accurate one. We've got another little shape here which is simple but accurate, and then all of the rest of it is cast ever so slightly in shadow, apart from this little shape of light. And if we get that little light shape accurate, the rest of the beak can just be cast in shadow, which is effectively what I do. And that gives us a very simple but accurate version of our beak. So let's look at the rest of the head, for example. So say we come in to the red face, and it does something kind of like that. And that's how I started, and then I stuck the triangle on the front. We want to make sure that triangle is, as we said, kind of accurate. And it does something like that. I'm not going to spend ages on the beak again. It would have been better if I'd done it with that one, wouldn't it? But And now we've got a simple shape and a simple but accurate shape. Now we need to really focus on making this work. And like I said, the finish and the realism isn't necessarily going to come from the detail. It's going to come from placing things in the right spot. So if we draw a line across there, we kind of hit very roughly the eye. So again, a simple but accurate shape for the eye. Simple but accurate. And then I'm going to very quickly show you how that applies to the paint itself as well. So that's kind of that shape, simple but accurate. And then we come in here and we say, right, what exactly is the angle as it does that? And we start to chip away at our initial very simple shape. And we're not adding detail. All we're doing is making the shape more accurate. And that's the point. That's the difference between detail and a simple accurate shape. So something kind of like that. That gives us our face. And then just very quickly, before we get back to the painting, let's look at the simple nature of painting a shape. So if we come in here with our red, we can make the shape incredibly simple in terms of the tone and in terms of the colour, and we can do that because the shape is accurate. And that's all it really has to be. It doesn't have to be much more than that. Yes, we can get into kind of softening edges. That takes it a little bit further, but we're still in the realm of kind of simple shape. And yes, we can introduce a darker tone, but it's still a simple but accurate shape. There's just a little bit of tonal variation within it. Equally with the dark of the eye. If we take that dark eye, for example, again, we can create a very simple shape. It can actually be all dark. It doesn't even have to have much tonal variation in it. Like I said, as long as it is accurate. And that's where the trick lies. The worst thing we can do is a very complicated shape that isn't accurate. That's almost far worse than doing a simple shape that is accurate. So nice accurate shape. Very simple because it's all one tone. The eye is very simple. And that's it. If you wanted to, you can make it a little more complex later by looking for some tonal variation. Like we could pull out a little bit of colour there, and we could pull out a little bit of colour there. It's still an accurate shape. It's still a simple shape, but it's just got a little bit more tonal variation within it. And that's it, guys. Don't forget that mantra, simple but accurate shapes. It will take you a long, long way with every medium and every single subject. Okay, so there we go. I hope that quick tips made sense. They usually seem to. But what we're going to do here is finish off the head with a bit more variation of tone, but not over fuss it, and put a little bit of colour in the top part of the beak, although I don't want to lose the sense of light. And then what I'm going to attempt to do here is go a little bit darker behind the blue tit, just to throw out the shape of him a little bit more. So we're just going to come in here, and it'll help trap that feeling of light as well. So just going to come up here, around there. Always feels scary, the first bit that you put on of a kind of a new darker background wash. But then we actually go to our big brush, as long as we're quick, don't want to mess around too much, and we can just kind of look for a sweep of colour kind of going that way. So let's get loads of paint in there. And then it's just a case of how dark do you want to go, and what sort of edge do you want this to have. By edge I mean, do you want it to have a hard edge or a soft edge, or kind of a bit of both. So this seems to be working better with a kind of slightly harder edge, then softening it down in places. And then we can load that wash now. We can really load that wash up, as long as we're quick. A little bit more careful around there, and then just spread that colour and get a bit of movement with the splashing as well. Always fun. Is there anywhere where we might go a little bit darker? Take that Prussian blue, really mix it nice and deep and dark, and just see if we can throw out. Doesn't have to be a really deep dark, but we're going to go a little bit darker. And what we might do is just dare we do it on the back? I don't think we're going to do it on the back. I don't think it needs it. We've got a kind of interesting dynamic composition, and it all kind of leads to the little guy in the middle. How dark do we want to go? I don't know, we could go maybe a little bit darker in the corner there. So start fairly watery, but not so watery it looks wishy-washy, just watery enough that the paint flows nicely and it all kind of flows together nicely. It's this sort of consistency, starting off watery and then eventually working towards this as I drop more colour in. If I was, the colour I'm dropping in now was to be more watery, or the brush is flooded with water, then we'd get into trouble because it would kind of backwash and we'd get cauliflowers and things like that. So I think as that stands, we're looking pretty good. And then again, will I let that dry off before going back to the beak, just to give it a little bit of colour? We are going to look at just popping in a very, very gentle shadow to break up the head of the Blue Tit a little bit, and we're after a very soft kind of purpley colour that for me is representing white in shadow, and we're just glazing over basically a bit of shadow in one or two areas. Glazing over a bit of shadow, a little bit of shadow. Oh, we've hit the green there, so that's going to dive into the face, which I don't want. So we're just going to pull that out. It's not a big problem as long as we get it while it's wet. Just pull out the pigment in that area, and then we go back in quickly and just make sure while it's wet, we kind of sharpen that edge up again and then soften that edge there. Yeah, just need to be careful we don't let that green float into the face too much. There we go. Okay, and actually, in fact, where I put the shadow, it didn't really need it there. That was a bit of a not the right decision all round, but that's fine. We can go just a little bit more shadow just there, and all it's doing is giving the area that could end up just being kind of white, which there's nothing wrong with that, but it gives it a little bit more depth of tone, and for me that's great because it gives it more shape, it gives it more form. And apart from that, colour on the beak, I think we're there. Okay, so now everything is pretty much dry enough. I just want to come in under here and take the markings there just across like that. Just feels like it wants to do that. And so we're stepping away from the photo a little bit and just deciding what the painting wants. I think we have every right to do that. And then I'm going to take that lovely kind of shadowy colour that I had for the face of the Blue Tit and add a little bit more pink, and I'm just going to glaze it ever so gently so it's not just a pure white of the page on the beak. Sometimes we want that white of the page, other times I just want to take some of the power out of it, of the white. And what it does is it makes the white in the rest of the bird kind of stand out a little bit more. And we might also take that same, just wash it ever so gently over that bit there, and so it knocks that bit down a bit. I want it to appear like there's some white markings there, but it's competing a little bit for attention with the white around the eye, which I want to stand out a little bit more. And that's basically it. I think we've got him there. So then that only leaves one thing to do, which is to do the signature. And the signature we're going to do over here, nice and simple. And there we go, we've got him. For me, some of the hardest things there were deciding actually what to do with the background. I quite not feeling afraid to have a big dark area that doesn't necessarily literally represent anything, and it doesn't even have to tie in with the other side. It's just abstract shapes that are a nice design element of the painting. They draw our attention to the bird and they support the feeling of kind of dark and light. A really nice deep dark here to trap the light on the front of the bird, but equally a little bit of colour there for me just traps that nice little bit of light on the back because it's quite a diffused light. Again, we ended up with a very bright white for the face, but again just that very, very subtle neutral colour mixed with a little bit of each of the primary, popped along in a couple of places. Doesn't need to be softened down or blended, just takes the edge off that, leaving the white of the page for the markings and other little hot spots. For me, that's a really fun little painting. They're such a great little bird and they're perfect for capturing with like kind of quick watercolour. Okay, so there we go, a Blue Tit in quick, fun watercolour style. As always guys, don't forget this isn't the only way to work in watercolour. You can work watercolour in a hyper realistic way if you want. You can take a lot more time doing it, you can build up more layers, but the idea behind these videos is a way of working that I really love with birds, because for me it captures the kind of fleeting nature of them. The way that watercolour gives us lovely light, vibrant washes, I think is really beautiful. For me it just lends itself to painting birds in this sort of a way. So that's why I love it. I just wanted to say that. So again, this was a really fun one. And I'm going to go back to doing some simpler ones as well, but I wanted to kind of explore some of these more complex birds because I know these birds are ones that a lot of people like, but they do represent challenges because they have all these different areas. They can appear quite complex. Hopefully what I've shown you in this video is how to take a complex subject and simplify it down. We start with big shapes, getting the proportions right in the drawing. We slowly move towards smaller shapes. If you're struggling, you can always err on the side of very, very light washes, throwing lots of colour around, just being careful to keep things reasonably separate. Let that all dry off and then reasonably simply kind of go back over the top with your slightly darker colours, slowly working towards your really deep darks, and don't rush towards the finish. Although watercolour requires a certain level of working reasonably fast, as long as you're working in small areas and you're not going too dark, you do have time and you can always go darker, so err on the side of slightly lighter. And that's it guys, don't forget to hit the like button, please feel free to comment, I'm loving hearing what you're all doing. If you're giving these a go yourself, you can always show me, drop me an email, contact me on social media. You can find me at all the links down below. Please do consider subscribing and you'll be the first to hear about any new videos that come out. There's going to be loads more. As I said in the first part, you can also hop over to Patreon and find the line drawing, as well as look at some of the other stuff I've got going on over there. So until next time guys, happy drawing, happy painting, happy creating, whatever it is that you do, and I shall catch you in the next video.
Out there